If I told you that there was a backdrop that you could have for using in your macro cage that would allow you to change backgrounds at the touch of a button and choose literally any background that your imagination could dream up, and you could do it for about $5, would you be interested? If so, stick around. I'll be right back. So this idea has been around for a long time. This is not a novel idea. People have been using iPads and laptops and all manner of other things, televisions probably, to use as lit backdrops. But using an iPad or a computer as an adjustable backdrop has always seemed a little bit over the top to me. I mean, I need to use my computer as a computer and my iPad as an iPad, come to think of it. But I must say the idea of using a picture frame had never really occurred to me until I ran across one. You can find these things in any shops that sell used merchandise. Obviously, whenever you're buying discarded electronics, you don't know what you're going to get till you get it home and plug it in. But I have found that a lot of the time, shops that sell used stuff like this, generally, if it doesn't have an adapter, they assume it's broken, which some of the time is true, but most of the time it's not. Now, if you find an older picture frame, they can run off some strange voltages and currents. The one I'm getting ready to show you is a 12-volt screen, but the ones you're most likely to find these days all run off 5 volts and 1 amp, which is basically what everything else runs off these days. So just because it doesn't have an adapter shouldn't stop you from picking one up. You can expect to pay at the low point $3 or $4 for one. The most expensive one I've ever bought was $12, and that was a slightly bigger one. Most of the time they're only small. They have about a 7-inch screen, but what I've discovered is that's more than enough territory. But before I show you the actual nitty-gritty of how to set one of these things up, I do want to talk to you just for a second about the whole idea of using backgrounds in macro photography. It seems to be something that people have strong positions on. So I'm going to kind of make my case for using them. But before we do, thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. Thank you to everybody who has made a donation through my website on the donation page over at allanwallsphotography.com. And I really appreciate it. And much though I hate doing this, I would like to urge anybody who's thought about chipping in a little bit but hasn't yet done so to reconsider that idea. This has been a challenging year, and I could certainly use any help I can get. All right, enough. Moving on. When I think about using backgrounds, I think of them as falling into one of 3 categories. The first is the natural background, kind of the incidental background, the one you find when you're out shooting macro in the field. But just because these backgrounds are incidental and largely a result of where the sun is in the sky and whether or not there are clouds and so on and so forth, we do have quite a bit of control over an incidental background. For example, changing our perspective on the subject can make all the difference in the world. There's more than a few photographs that I've taken lying on my back with my camera pointed straight up, or on my knees, or down on my belly. There are a lot of things that we can do creatively to move around in such a way that we get a backdrop that really works for our subject. But certainly it takes practice, and you need to know what you're looking for. I talked a few weeks ago about planning your outings. Well, backdrops is one of the main reasons you think about your outing before you go. If you're familiar with the area you're going to, there are going to be certain times of day when you can almost ensure that you'll get good, well-lit backgrounds. And there are others when you absolutely can't. Of course, if you're going somewhere new, you have to take what you find. But you can certainly stack the deck in your favor by thinking ahead of time, what is the best time of day to go to this location or that. The second category of backgrounds are what I call static backgrounds. They consist basically of a piece of card. It can be black card, white card, or anything in between, any color you can come up with. But the card is not lit independently. It is just the card. So if you were using a static background outdoors, for example, any light that falls on the background is the natural light that's in the environment. And likewise, any static backdrop that you use in the studio in your macro cage like this will only be lit by the lighting of your specimen. So it will be spillover light. I don't particularly like using static backdrops. They're hard to manage. There is one particular kind of static background that I would be very, very careful with, and that is a black background. A black background on its own can provide an interesting and dramatic portrait of your insect, but it comes with difficulties. The main difficulty being that darker insects have a bad tendency to blend into the darkness of your background. And when you have deep shadows, say on the underside of an insect, and the detail is lost into the dark background, your stacking program can have a very hard time figuring out what to stack. And when a stacking program encounters noise, and that's all it has, and it doesn't really know what it's looking at, it will stack the noise, and that leads to all manner of artifacts. Now, somebody who uses static colored backgrounds to great effect is Paweł Skakowski, the Polish macro photographer that we featured in a video a short while back. He uses natural light to illuminate colored backdrops that he carries with him in the field and does it really, really well. The third category, and the one that we're going to be talking about today, is the dynamic background. A dynamic background is a background that's illuminated, either from the front or with transmitted light from behind. Either way, these backgrounds are actually lit themselves. They don't use the same lighting that you have your specimen set up with. Anybody who's watched any of my macro videos know that my go-to backdrop lighting is to actually set it all up behind the macro cage using a large panel of the color I want to use with separate studio lights usually on it, usually two, one from each side, so that I can build my own gradients and I can adjust the brightness of the background with the position of the lights and so on. That is one example of a dynamic background. Dynamic backgrounds can be as simple as a clear white illuminated background. You can, of course, do anything you want with a white background. You can position the animal any way you want. You can have additional props like twigs and leaves and branches, anything that you want to do. But I think you'll find that a lot of the time people use a plain white background when they don't want any other distractions. What they're doing is documenting the marvelous insect in all of its glory and leaving nothing up for interpretation. It's a very scientific, clinical way to photograph, and frankly, it's one of the hardest ways to produce macro images. These images are by Bryce McQuillan, one of the very best white background macro photographers that I know. He is actually using these photographs for scientific reasons. He's documenting species in this way, but his imagery is really stunning. He also obviously pays a great deal of attention to his foreground lighting, but he gets his white backgrounds absolutely perfect and they complement the insects beautifully. Check out some more of his work. I'll put a link in the show notes so that you can see that. It's a little more common for those of us who would consider our macro photography closer to art than science. That we will lean towards using some color in the background. There are a number of good reasons, I think, to use colored backgrounds, so long as they all meet one important requirement, and that is that they be subtle, almost subliminal, almost unnoticeable, that the color of the background does something to the picture of the insect without taking over from the picture of the insect. You certainly don't want a backdrop that is more interesting than your subject, for example. One of the ways that a dynamic background can be very interesting in macro photography is to use a lit background to accentuate and emphasize the color of your insect, especially if it's a brightly colored insect. There are ways, just like you do in any other kind of photography, you choose your colors very carefully so that you can create a harmonious overall picture. But remember, it still needs to be subtle. Other ways you can use color is to use a selection of colors that are fairly analogous to the color of your insect to create a more subdued, slightly less contrasty photograph. One of the ways that I use color in my photographs is to very subtly tell part of a story about the insect. I have done this, I think, unconsciously for many, many years, and it was pointed out to me by somebody else, but oftentimes I'll use a pale blue background for insects that you would commonly expect to find up in the air. Things with wings, things that fly. I seem to usually select a background that hints at the sky. For subjects that seem more at home on the ground or on rock, I may use sand-colored or very light gray backgrounds just to hint at their environment a little bit. Same thing with a light green background reminiscent of a field. And that can be a very effective way to use a little bit of color in the background to really give some context to your insect photographs. And this is especially true if you're posing your insects. If you have a completely flat, symmetrical insect, that might not work quite as well. But if you're positioning an insect head on or in some type of a natural appearing pose, then these backgrounds that hint at their environment can be very, very effective. Now, what is cool about using a repurposed electronic picture frame as a background is that you can create any of those types of dynamic backdrop that you want very simply, very quickly. And you can have them at your fingertips anytime you want them. And I'm going to walk you through that. There isn't really very much to building one of these. There are a couple of important steps to bear in mind. First of all, when you come across one of these things, whether it's sitting in a box in your closet or at the local junk shop, it almost certainly is going to have a frame. That's kind of the idea. Some of the modern ones don't. This one does not. This is a Sony one that I got for $5.50. This is an old one, uses a 12-volt power supply. This one, which I stumbled across just a couple of days ago, is a Hewlett-Packard, which came in this brown wooden frame. The first thing I do is take the frame and the matting off and put a picture in it. They're oftentimes really nice frames, and I'll put one of my own photographs in one of these to give to somebody at Christmas, because I can't afford to give them a Christmas present. But that's a completely other story. What you get out of it is this. This is the business. And really, there's not very much you have to do with it. I would urge you, if you're looking for one of these, or if you come across one of these, make sure that it has some kind of attachment apparatus on the back. It's not vital. You can always glue something on or carefully drill a hole in the casing for these, but it's a lot easier if it has some kind of a hanging mechanism. Now, if you get really lucky, or if you actually spend the money to buy one of these. You know, it never occurred to me until now, but you can probably buy these for not very much money, brand new. But I hit the jackpot with this one because not only did it come with a nice solid wooden frame with the glass and matting already in it, but it also came with an unused power adapter. It's the standard 5-volt 1 amp adapter that virtually everything uses these days, and a remote. This is really gonna make this a first class effort, and that's all you need. You can add a layer of diffusion if you want to, but the way I use them, it's really not necessary, and I'll explain that in just a second. So the advantages of using one of these are multiple. The first and biggest advantage is you can make your own backgrounds exactly the way you want them. It's one of the big limitations of using a static lit background. If I want a very specific color, I have to go buy a white piece of board and paint it, basically. And you can't even find all the shades of color in paints. And that can get quite expensive. I've been doing it for years and years and years. But you end up with a huge room full of pieces of board of all different colors. And it served me well. I mean, I don't begrudge having done it, but this is so much easier. To create your backgrounds, it is a quick trip into Photoshop. In fact, let's run over to Photoshop very quickly and I'll show you precisely how I would make a backdrop. Making backdrops in Photoshop really is a piece of cake. You just go to the home page, hit create new, select a document the same size as your frame size, the same aspect ratio. 72 ppi is fine for resolution. Click on the color picker to choose the background you want. We'll just go with white for this demonstration. Hit OK and then create, and you have a completely white document. Now, what I always do is make a copy of my background. That's just a habit. You don't really need to do it in this case, but it keeps the white background for us. Create a new layer as a copy by hitting Command J. And then what we can do is fill that by going to Edit, Fill, selecting color from our choices, pick the color that we want, say sky blue, hit OK. Keep the opacity 100%, blend mode normal, and hit OK. And then you have your blue sky. Simple as that. If instead of having a blue sky, you wanted some kind of a gradient, say light blue to darker blue, all you have to do is click on the gradient tool, click on your gradient, and then select the colors where the gradient starts and where the gradient stops by clicking on these little boxes. When you click on one, this color picker will appear, and you can select the color for that end of your gradient. Then click on the box on the other end, click on the color, and you can change the gradient to whatever you want. Click OK. And then once you've defined your gradient and you've set your transition point by using this little diamond slider, hit OK. And then when you draw a line on your canvas, it will lay out the gradient that you have selected. I actually had a radial gradient selected there. Let me take us back to a linear gradient and do the same thing. There you have it. So you can create gradients in any colors, any shades that you want. And of course, if you choose to use a different direction for your line, you'll change the transition of the gradient. And you can do this in any number of ways. One of the creative ways that I like to do it is to set a gradient that is one shade of green, let's say a very pale greenish yellow. That looks fine. And then pick the end of the gradient that's a little darker green, but still very grassy looking. We'll say that. And now what you can do is by adding a linear gradient like we just did, you can give the impression of a field going into a forest, for example. You could also make the gradient green to light blue, for example, as if you were going from the grass to the sky. Remember, these are all going to be very ill-defined, very, very fuzzy. That's the way they're going to look best on your project. Let's say you had drawn this and you wanted to add, say, some flowers to give it a little bit of interest. What you could do is hit B for brush, create a new layer first, and then select the color for your flowers. Let's say we're going to do poppies. Using the right and left brackets, you can make your paintbrush smaller or larger, and then at 100% opacity, you can just start painting flowers in. Of course, as you get further and further back in the scene, you want your flowers to get smaller and smaller, so it's fairly realistic. If you don't want to fill with a color, there is another option you have. You can instead fill with a pattern by going to Edit, Fill, and then from the drop-down menu, pick Pattern instead of Color. And then you can open up an endless selection of different backgrounds that you can use. Here's a grass one, very, very dark. Here's an autumn grass. Let's try that. So we pick that for our fill, and there you go. And there are any number of other patterns that you can use. Say you like this as a backdrop, but you wanted to add some perspective to make it look like it's disappearing into the distance. Well, with this pattern layer selected, if you go to Edit, Transform Perspective, you can stretch out the foreground and allow everything to drop off into the background like so. And then, of course, you'd just trim this down to size, and using your crop tool, leave it the original ratio. So this is still the same size as your screen, and now you have perspective. Now, most of the time, you're not going to have this much detail that you want to have in focus, so you won't need anything nearly this extravagant. And there are a million other ways that you can create interesting backdrops with the hundreds of tools at your disposal in Photoshop. And of course, you don't actually have to create anything. You can simply use one of your photographs and download it onto the picture frame the way you download the gradients and the color panels that you've made, and use that as your backdrop. Remembering that depending on where you position the panel, it's going to be very out of focus, which is what you want. So the sky's the limit. There's simply no bounds to what you can put on your backgrounds with a little imagination. Now, there are multiple ways that you can get the backdrops from your computer onto the picture frame. I have run into problems with older picture frames that don't take modern media. They don't seem to work with SD cards and flash cards that are newer. And some of these frames I've got are really old, but all of them work with a USB cable. For some reason, most of the connections on these things are the the mini USB, the slightly fatter mini one. I don't know why that seems to be the convention, but any USB cable with that connection, hook it up to your computer and it will recognize the picture frame as a new drive. And all you have to do is dump your images onto that and you're done. That's all there is to it. It takes moments to do. Be warned, by the way, when you buy one of these at a junk shop, brace yourself for the images that might be on it. If it wasn't of other people, I'd show them to you. But yeah, it's shocking that people would give these things away without thinking to clear the menu first. All right, so running the thing consists of making sure that your power supply is plugged in and that you have enough play that you'll be able to move the panel up and down if you need to, and then simply turn it on. They almost all have an LED that glows to show you where the button is. Once you turn it on, all you have to do is hit the up and down arrows depending on the device you have, and it'll move you through the images. What I have done with mine is arrange my images in a kind of ground up order, so that I know roughly where I am when I turn the thing on and pull up an image. I know that if it's a greenish image, that I have to go up to get to the sky. And if it's a greenish image, I have to go down to get to my dirt colors. I thought that was quite genius, actually. Anyway, you can do it any way you want. So this is all there is to it. The picture frame is mounted. This one actually came with two little holes. What I did was I took these little metal tubes. They're part of a shoe rack or some other device I found. There was a whole stack of these hollow metal tubes, and I thought they'd come in handy, and they're perfect for this. So I just bolted them at the top and bottom. Originally, I had them right next to the blocky part of the middle of the frame. The idea was I wanted something that would hold the frame horizontally, wouldn't allow it to twist in any way. That worked great. And then I discovered that the plug-in for this was on one of the sides. So what I had to do was add a few cubes of acrylic that I had lying around so that it would mimic this part of the box, again allowing it to stay completely vertical. The controls for this one does not have a remote control. So it has a power button, and then I can cycle through my various backgrounds, and I'll show you that from the front in just a second. The only other thing back here that's worth pointing out, this, by the way, is the power cord. This one is a 12-volt device, one of the older ones. But the only other thing to show you is the system that I use for repositioning it. Now, the way this is set up, I have a camera sitting almost directly on the focusing rail. I would seldom use it like that. And as my camera moves up, as I add, for example, a bellows, I need to be able to reposition my backdrop so that I am always getting the sweet spot in the center of the screen. So all I've done, I put a ring bolt right through the PVC pipe. It's a 3/16 screw, just screwed in by hand. Just drill a hole through it and bolt it on there. And I run a little piece of cord. I had some metal stuff that I was using, but this just is easier to work with. So I just ran the cord through these two eyelets. They're not attached there. They just run right through to a couple more of these ring bolts up the side, and to another set of ring bolts at the front, where I have also attached a key ring, is all it is. So that when I want to reposition the device for the height that I'm going to use, all I have to do is pull the cord and attach it for the new height. These are I actually measured these heights to use with all the different equipment that I may have above my rail. So this allows me to put the frame wherever I want it from that end of the cage, just by repositioning this cord. It could not be easier, and it's solid. It stays put. I intend to just leave this on all the time because I have absolutely nothing else I want to use the picture frame from, but taking it off would simply consist of untying the string, and there's nothing else holding it attached. So let's go around to the front and let me show you what it actually looks like for taking pictures. Let me put it back down to the correct height. Right about there. Let's go to the front. So this is really all there is to it. With the panel suspended at the right height for the camera, all I have to do is scroll through the backdrops until I find the one I want. And if I don't have the one I want, I can go make another one. And obviously, I use mostly fairly subtle colors. Now, if you want an even more subtle background, it's very easy to attach a diffusion panel. You can use a sheet of tracing paper. My favorite thing to use is it's actually the diffusion screen taken out of an LCD screen, a broken one. And this very much softens the image, and you can place it as close or as far from the screen as you need to adjust your effects. It can work equally well with or without the diffusion piece in place. Now, of course, one of the dynamics that you have control over is how out of focus do you want the panel to be. It would be just as easy to put these upright bars in such a way that the panel were closer to your specimen. It would just be a redesign of the suspension mechanism. But if you wanted to have your background in a little sharper view, it would just be a matter of moving the panel a little bit closer. I'm mimicking that by focusing the camera. Now, of course, the camera would actually be focused back here, and the pattern becomes very subtle. But the way you design the backdrops will determine how it looks at different lengths. As you can see from this one, I have a fairly distinct pattern on the background. When the camera is focused all the way back on the specimen, that pattern will disappear, and it'll just leave very, very soft and subtle changes in the background light. Let's see what else we've got on here. Yeah, this is one where I mimicked a green underbrush with twigs or branches in the background. Again, if you focus all the way in on it, it's a horrible looking thing. But as you focus back out, you can get this very subtle effect of being in the woods. So one of the other very important ways that you can use this backdrop is by moving it closer and further away from the subject. Because the closer it is to the subject, the more you will be able to reveal the detail in the background. Whereas at its full distance right now, it falls into complete softness, being totally out of focus. So it's really quite versatile. You can basically do anything with this that you could do with your standard backdrop setup of lighting and colored panels and so on and so forth. But you can do all of this at the touch of a button in a very compact space. And I think that's the advantage of it. So the sky's the limit with how you can use this thing. You can create any backdrop your heart desires in about 2 minutes in Photoshop and have it permanently available in your macro cage. So in my experiments using this thing, I have discovered a creative tool that I really want to harness more effectively. For example, normally when my specimen is positioned about here, 11 or so inches from the front of this particular lens, the background is going to be completely defocused. It will be very, very soft, and any gradients will be incredibly subtle. If I'm using small things like little blobs of color for flowers, they may disappear altogether at this distance. Now, for many applications, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. But occasionally, I want a little bit more detail to show through. One way you could do that is simply to pull the focus closer to the screen. But if you do that, your subject goes out of focus. And then another issue is that when we're focus stacking, our lens is moving. So the focus is changing also on the screen. But the thing is, at a long separation, it doesn't really make any difference. The difference in defocusing isn't going to change over a centimeter of movement of the lens. But when I want to get a little bit more definition and see some of the detail that's in the homemade backdrop that I made, I would like to be able to move the screen forward and backwards. So let's say, for example, I have a slightly more detailed background that I want to use, and because I want some of that detail to be visible to the camera, I position the panel closer to my subject. Now that will give me exactly what I'm looking for, but there's a problem. And that is, as I do my focus stack and the camera position moves, those details are going to come more in focus than I wanted. I want them to remain out of focus to the same degree. This isn't an issue when the panel is all the way back, or especially if I'm using a colored panel 3 feet behind the macro cage. That's never an issue. But if this thing is positioned very precisely to give me the amount of softness or sharpness that I want in my background, that's going to change as I focus stack. So what I am doing is I'm redesigning the cage with an extension of the main platform, and I have built a linear actuator. What I don't have yet is the mechanism to hold this thing vertical. But what I'm going to do is synchronize the movement of the focusing rail with the movement of my panel, so that as the camera lens moves forward, my panel moves back at exactly the same rate. So I think that is going to make this my go-to background. I can't imagine needing to use anything else once I have that functionality. So the way it's set up now, it's perfectly good for single shot images with a macro lens. But I think for focus stacking, if I want more definition on my backdrop, then I'll need to have a way to synchronize the movement of the panel with the movement of the camera. But remember, 99% of the time, I don't have any detail in my background that I want to be visible to the camera. So for anybody that likes to use backdrops creatively and would like to have at their fingertips a whole array of different backgrounds that they could use at the touch of a button, and if you have $5 and if you know how to use any kind of creative editing program, whether it's Photoshop or whatever else you have, this is something you really ought to do. If you've already got a macro cage, adding this functionality is peanuts. You've got to drill a couple of holes and screw some things in by hand. Heck, if you've got a macro cage, you've already done more complicated work than mounting one of these panels. I haven't looked this up, I meant to, but I'm pretty sure that you can buy a cheap electronic picture frame from one of those Chinese online shops where you can buy electronic stuff that's the same stuff that you buy with a brand name on it over here. It's identical inside, it just doesn't have a brand name on it. You can get it for pennies on the dollar. The drawback is, of course, it takes about 1.5 years to get to your house. When it arrives, you'll have forgotten what you needed it for. It's a trade-off. So that's it. Thanks again to Bryce McQuillan for allowing me to share a couple of his photographs. Be sure to check out his work. One other thing, don't be alarmed if you see 1-minute videos by me. This is something new that YouTube is doing, and I thought it might be a good opportunity for me to broaden my audience. A lot of people won't click on 68-minute videos, but they might click on a 1-minute video. These videos all have to be posted vertically so they look strange except on your phone. Yeah, that's what they are. Don't be alarmed. I haven't lost my marbles completely. There is method to my madness. If this was useful or helpful or just fun to watch and you are not already subscribed, please subscribe and make your neighbor subscribe if you know him or her. Even if you don't, go over, introduce yourself and ask them to subscribe. I'll be back in a few days. Don't know what I'm doing next. Could be one of several things. But until then, take care, be safe. I'll see you soon.